All right, it looks like we still have folks joining, but in the interest of everybody's time here, we're going to go ahead and get started. And thank you all for those who have joined the webinar already and those to come. My name is Rob Lahane. Today, we're going to be talking about the COVID vaccine and how that relates to both employee and employer rights and how to stay compliant with your return to work strategy and factoring in the vaccine for COVID-19 that is obviously rapidly ramping up. Get started today, as I mentioned, I'm Rob Lahane. I am the CEO of TouchCare, which is a healthcare concierge healthcare advocacy company. We work with hundreds of employers across the United States and hundreds of thousands of employees in helping them navigate the complexities of all of the healthcare system, everything related to the employee and family member healthcare experience, whether that be selecting and enrolling in the right plans or finding the right care or finding the price for care or negotiating a bill, whatever that may be. Our team is here and ready to help. I have with us today, and I'm excited to introduce Dorit Reese. Dorit is a professor of law at UC Hastings, and she is in the administrative and governmental law and healthcare law and policy department, and she is an expert on vaccine law and policy. So super excited to have her here with us today to talk through all of the complexities related to employer reopening strategies and how that mixes in with COVID-19 vaccination requirements if and when that becomes relevant for folks. So Dorit, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and so just to kick things off real quick before I do send it over to Dorit to get into the nuts and bolts of the presentation, I did want to just give a quick snapshot of sort of where things stand today. And this data is actually even a little bit dated now, right? So by mid-April, when we put this presentation together, about 22% of the US population had actually received both doses or were considered fully vaccinated. That number has now risen to 25, and nearly 40% of folks have actually received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. So, as the Biden administration said when they first came into office, that their strategy was to get 100 million folks vaccinated in the first 100 days. You can see that the efforts have been ramping very quickly, and by all intents and purposes, the U.S. seems to be doing a pretty good job of distributing the vaccine and getting folks vaccinated quickly. Um, what that's done is created sort of an overwhelming eagerness for folks to return to some sort of normalcy, right? We can sort of, the light is at the end of the tunnel for some folks. People are thinking about, how we sort of return to life, return to normalcy, return to work, return to, sporting events and concerts and restaurants and just normal life the way that we had it before. Um, and that presents a really interesting challenge for employers who, by and large, have, if they can, been working remote for the better part of the last 12 to 13 months. And so now, as employers are considering reopening their doors, a lot of what we're hearing is just questions around, what can or can't we do related to requiring folks to vaccinate, requiring folks to test, requiring folks to answer health questionnaires, things like that, in an effort to create a safe workplace. And this is, a challenge that many employers have never really had to think about before. Is how do I create a safe workplace for my employees that makes them both feel safe and actually controls the risk of any sort of spread, specifically of COVID-19, but really of any sort of airborne illnesses or illnesses that are sort of taking spotlight nowadays, just in light of the COVID pandemic. And so, today we explore this topic in a little more detail with Dorit, to hopefully help employers navigate some of these questions as they prepare to reopen their doors. And some interesting stats there at the bottom of the page, right? 70% of employees, and this is Glassdoor data, but 70% of employees feel that a vaccination should be required prior to returning to the office. Yet, less than 1% of employers currently have a vaccine mandate, and only about 6% in an employee benefits news poll recently said that they were considering a vaccine mandate. So it's a little bit lopsided here as you see employees feel a little bit more strongly maybe than employers do. And part of that might be because of the fact that we don't really have great information out there quite yet about what can and can't be done, and how um, how things will take shape here over the next few months as more and more folks get vaccinated. So Dorit is here to shed some light on these topics for us from a legal, from an ethical, and really from a moral standpoint, and help us think through some of these questions, and maybe help employers better plan on how they can reopen their doors. So with that, I will kick it over to you, Dorit.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me. The only warning I'll give in advance is that, like many of you, I have a child in the other room studying. He should stay there, but I apologize if there'll be a cameo appearance. So what I want to do is give a short presentation on what's the law surrounding mandates. And the starting point for this has to be that historically, employers have the right to set health and safety conditions for the workforce, and that includes vaccines mandates. And we have a history of employers, for example, requiring influenza vaccines for healthcare or hepatitis A vaccines for restaurants. There are some caveats and limits, and there's one wrinkle that's special to these vaccines, an EUA, but vaccine mandates aren't new. I'm going to take a step back and start at the federal and state level because that might impact what employers can and cannot do, and then we'll zoom in on what happens in the employment area. So the starting point is that the federal government has limited powers to mandate vaccines, but has some powers. So the federal government can regulate incoming travel and interstate travel. So in theory, it could require a vaccine for entry into the United States or for interstate travel. It doesn't look like they're going to move there, but they do have the authority. And if they were using it, they would probably draw on their authority under the Public Health Act on Section 361, which is mentioned here, which has been the basis, for example, for a federal government building mask mandate. There's questions whether that would stand in court, but it doesn't look like it's happening. So I'm not going to spend much time on that. These clauses also allow Congress to incentivize states, as mentioned here, by offering financial incentive to states that pass the vaccine mandate. That hasn't happened yet as well. The one thing that may impact US employers that is related to international travel is that we can probably expect other countries to condition entry on vaccine, or some countries are allowing entry with 14 days quarantine. We may expect those countries to say, quarantine or show us that you're vaccinated. And that can impact businesses that rely on international travel. And there's also some indication that some airlines may voluntarily require travelers to show vaccine status, and that would impact travel for business as well. Next slide. States are the ones that have the main authority to mandate, or for that matter, prohibit mandates. For example, states have traditionally required vaccine for school attendance. Some states impose university attendance requirement. About 20 states have some laws about influenza vaccines for healthcare workers. Most of them aren't exactly mandates. So some of them require employers to report on the percentage of the population vaccinated, or require healthcare employers to make vaccines available to their employees. About 3 states also have something closer to a mandate, which imposes sanctions on unvaccinated employees. So states can impose vaccine mandates. They have to meet constitutional requirements, but those are pretty loose. Under Jacobson versus Massachusetts, you can impose a public health measure that touches on individual rights as long as it's for public health necessity, proportionate, reasonable, and not discriminatory. So states can do that, but historically states haven't imposed universal vaccine mandates, and there's nothing on the cards right now. As I'll mention later, some states are moving to prohibit employers from requiring vaccines, and I'll get to that a little later. Let's focus on employers. So there's a number of things you have to keep in mind when you're considering whether to mandate a vaccine. One is the fact that we're acting in an area of legal uncertainty. Right now, these vaccines are not fully approved by the FDA. They're under an emergency use authorization. Pfizer says that it will apply for a full license this month, but historically it took the FDA about 12 months to decide on such an application. I expect they'll do their best to be faster, but it will take them some time to decide whether to license the vaccine. So for the next few months, the vaccines are going to be under an EUA. There's legal uncertainty whether you can mandate a vaccine under an EUA, and it's because the law is written in a way that doesn't seem to have considered that. The law says that the Secretary of Health has to notify recipients that they can accept or refuse the vaccine. Say some, if they can accept or refuse the vaccine, that means no mandate. But the law says nothing about employers. And although historically the federal agencies also thought that you can't mandate a vaccine under an EUA, the latest guidance from the CDC is that mandates are a question of state and local law, which suggests that since we know that employers could have mandated vaccines in the past with some limits, they can mandate a vaccine under an EUA. There's no court decision on this yet. There are at least two cases I know of, one by a correction officer in New Mexico and one by officials in the Los Angeles School District challenging an employee mandate. They're both very early, so we don't have any court decision on this. As mentioned here, if you are requiring a vaccine, the Fair Labor Standards Act suggests that you need to give the employee time to get that. It's considered hours of work, and you need to allow the employee paid time to get the vaccine. And I want to refer people to the EEOC guidance that suggested that employers usually can require a vaccine with the usual caveats, which we'll get to in a moment. Next slide. So, things to keep in mind. When we're talking about the vaccine mandate, the strongest form of vaccine mandate is vaccinate or you're fired. Those have been upheld in the past in the healthcare context for influenza mandates and in other contexts. So yes, in theory, you can't say vaccinate or be fired. It's a workplace rule unless an employee has a valid right to an exemption or there's another legal protection. You can go as far as firing them, but remember that you can also have a vaccine mandate that's softer. So vaccinate or you have to stay working from home. Only people who are vaccinated can come back to the workplace. Vaccinate or you have to wear extra PPE. You can have a mandate with lesser condition than firing the employee, but you can go as far as firing. And again, there is a legal question about EUA vaccine, emergency use authorization, but there's reason to think that you can mandate even an EUA vaccine. Several legal sources address whether you can require proof of a vaccine, and the EEOC, which is the agency in charge on applying the American with Disabilities Act, said that asking about proof of a vaccine isn't an ADA violation, but it may be a violation. It's not a violation, but it may trigger the ADA if you're asking about the medical reason to refuse the vaccine. And there you need to take the precaution you would when inquiring for disability for other accommodations. If you have a unionized workforce, your collective bargaining agreement may require negotiating with the union before you can mandate a vaccine. You may not be able to do it unilaterally. I know this sounds very qualified and undetermined, but these collective bargaining agreements vary, and it really depends on the specific agreement in the specific workplace. If you mandate a vaccine and someone has a side effect, that is a work-related injury, and workers' compensation would apply to that employee and may cover it. I do want to mention in this context that if there's a COVID-19 outbreak in the workplace and one of your employees gets COVID-19 on the workplace, that's probably also a workplace injury and may be covered. So if you're considering the concerns about liability for a vaccine harm, also consider the possibility of liability if vaccine rates are too low and there's an outbreak. Next slide. There's Besides unions and besides the UA, there's two other limits on the ability to impose a vaccine mandate. Workers with a medical contraindication to the vaccine, and those are going to be rare cases. Right now, for the mRNA vaccine, it's people with allergies. The J&J may be limited to some population because of concerns about clotting, but a worker with a medical reason not to vaccinate should be accommodated under the American with Disabilities Act, unless it's a high burden, a too high burden, and the bar here is very high, or the worker is a direct threat. If there's no way to mitigate the threat from the worker in terms of COVID-19, for example, if you have an especially vulnerable population, or if you have reason to think that the risk of COVID-19 outbreaks is high, it may be okay not to accommodate. But in the usual run of things, you may have to accommodate. And I'll talk about accommodations in a moment, because I want to mention that there's another potential sort of accommodation requirements, and that's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you can't discriminate between workers on a number of categories, and the relevant one is religion. Under the Act, if an employee has a sincere religious objection to workplace rule, you have to accommodate them unless it's an undue burden. And here, undue burden is a much lower bar. It means no more than minimal costs. In both cases, reasonable accommodation isn't always what the worker wants. It may be the right thing for your workplace to offer a full exemption, but there may be other things that you may offer that would substitute for that. For example, the better things might be to offer on-campus work, on-site work for people who can get the vaccine, off-site work for people who can't, or have workers that can't be vaccinated work separately from the rest of the workforce to decrease the risk to them and others. Or require extra PPE. While you can't make public the disabled status of an exempt employee, hospitals have used mask requirements for non-vaccinating employees in the past, and those seem to be upheld by courts. So requiring extra PPE is probably a reasonable accommodation as well. I do want to point out that at least for the medically exempt employee, there's two reasons for a mandate. One is, and both depend on the fact that the mandate protects both the employee and others. One is to protect the employee themselves, because you owe your employees a safe workplace, and the other is to protect other employees. The employees who medically can't get a vaccine are, in a sense, the victims here. Even if they want to protect themselves, it's unsafe for them. And it's important to remember that the few people who can't be vaccinated are one reason for mandates. The mandates are there for their benefits. So accommodating them is probably the right thing to do as well. I also want to mention that we have a number of states who have built in the work limiting the ability of private employers to require vaccines. Now, none of these bills have passed so far. It's not clear that any will pass. We know that several states, Florida and Texas, for example, have issued, the governor has issued an executive order saying that some businesses, including businesses who receive state money, cannot require vaccine as a work condition or as a service condition. There is probably going to be litigation around that, around the power of the governors to do that. Legislators may have more power to do that, and some are considering this. Legislators probably have the constitutional power to limit the ability of private employers to require vaccines, but these bills are hard to pass. We don't know if any will pass. This might be a place for you to speak up and say, we have good reason not to want this, because there are certainly some businesses that may have excellent reason to mandate the vaccine, both financially and in terms of handling a vulnerable population. Next slide. Just because you can doesn't always mean you should. One question is, can you mandate a vaccine? There's a good chance that you can mandate a vaccine under an EUA. I would expect that there will be lawsuits about this. Might not be for your businesses, but there are already 2 lawsuits, and I expect there will be other lawsuits. But there are good arguments that mandating a vaccine under an EUA is legal. And as long as you comply with anti-discrimination law, it's probably legal to mandate the vaccine. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right choice. A number of things come in, including access, including do you have less strong options? What's the atmosphere within your workforce? What are your needs? If you have a workforce that needs to travel highly, they may have to vaccinate because the places they travel to or their airlines will require vaccines as part of it. And what's the level of risk to people in your workforce? There are also other options available to you. You can use incentives, increase access, provide education. All of these are other options that you can use before getting to vaccination, before getting to vaccine mandate. And the main thing is, this is not a situation where you can sit back and hope that things sort themselves out. We've seen in this pandemic that sitting back and waiting tends to backfire. This is a situation where you proactively need to ask yourself, how do I make my workplace safe? How do I, what kind of policy do I want to put in place? Do I want to put in place an incentive? Do I want to put in place a mandate? And I think the next slide addresses incentives some more, and I'll go back to that in a moment. Do I want to put in place a mandate? Which workers do I want to apply which policy to? And you have freedom to tailor your policy according to different kinds of workers. Is there enough access for my workforce? Does my workforce have a concern that I can address elsewhere? So are they, for example, concerned about having time off if they have a day or two of a vaccine side effects? And if so, can I help them there? So it's crucial to think about this, have a set policy, and go through these issues. Next slide. Yes. So universities are also really going through discussing mandates. And one of the things that comes up is mandates by themselves probably aren't enough. You should back the mandates with, where possible, help in getting access to the vaccine. That's going to vary by states. Some states have easier access. Some have had very challenging steps towards access. If you're the kind of employer that can host a vaccination clinic on your site, that has a lot of advantages, it also raises something that you need to consider. For example, an on-site vaccination clinic may raise questions about privacy, may raise question on whether it's a wellness program. And if it's a wellness program, there is a limit to how much incentives you can give to employees for a wellness program. The limits are not well defined. The EOC was proposing regulation on that, but as far as I know, that hasn't moved forward. So there may be a limit to the incentives if you're hosting the clinic, and you have to worry about privacy. Consider responding to concerns of the workforce, maybe by hosting a panel about answering vaccine questions, providing information. Remember privacy. If you're a healthcare provider, HIPAA would apply towards, if you're hosting the vaccination clinic and you're acting as a provider towards your employees. But at any rate, all states have medical privacy laws, and many of them protect employees' information from privacy. And the American with Disabilities Act also limits the ability to disclose which employees are exempt. So consider privacy, make sure that everything is recorded in addition to the privacy. If you are not quite comfortable going to mandate, several employers have came up with very creative incentives program, ranging from cash to days off. And those are certainly an issue for you. Whatever you come up with should be transparently communicated to your workforce. And generally speaking, the main point to remember is there's quite a bit of legal leeway for you. There's going to remain legal leeway unless your state passes a specific law about that limits your ability to mandate vaccine, in which case you need to look at your state's law and follow that. But you need to proactively think about what it is you want to put in place, how it's going to work, and how you're going to protect important interests such as the privacy of people with disabilities, the transparency of your program, and the safety of your workforce. I'm going to stop here.
Awesome. Thank you, Dorit. That's super helpful. We've got a ton of questions coming in, and we've got just a couple more slides. We'll jump over to the questions and answers here in just a few minutes, but super helpful information. I think just in light of what you had mentioned and sort of the spirit of what you were talking about, Dorit, was this common theme of the rules to the game have changed a little bit, just in the sense that employers need to, and maybe I shouldn't say the rules of the game have changed, but the focus has changed in the sense that employers now have this new responsibility to create a safe workplace for their employees in light of the COVID pandemic. And so, just real quick to go through here, right? TouchCare earlier last summer, in working in partnership with a handful of our clients, many of whom were considered essential and needed to have their employees back in the workplace as early as last May and June, or even earlier. Before there was vaccines available, we started working with employers on strategies for testing employees and doing bulk testing of employees and surveillance testing of employees, and creating an app and platform experience for employees to easily be able to complete a daily health survey like so many of us have gotten used to. And our effort was really to do the same thing as we're talking about today, right? So starting with keeping things compliant, making sure that everything that you do as an employer is compliant. We help create the handbook or the playbook for coming back to work, and then creating the right screening and testing programs around that to make employees safe, which is really the ultimate goal here, right? And to some degree, it's not necessarily about uh, necessarily trying to get any sort of information about folks, or violate anything from a HIPAA or privacy standpoint, as much as it is about the responsibility of the employer to make sure that the workplace is actually a safe place for people to come every day. And so we introduced a testing program. We have the ability to provide, and still do, we still are working with plenty of employers on this, bulk testing, viral testing for employees, that is self-administered, EUA authorized test that does not need to be um, provided or overseen by a doctor. And so, our goal was to create a really easy way for employers to make their employees safer in the workplace by providing options for surveillance testing, and then wrapping around our concierge services and in-person services to be able to help anybody with any sort of questions or challenges with navigating their own health situation or the healthcare system, whether that be COVID related or not. The program has been very successful in the sense that we have many employers who have implemented the testing strategies with their employees, and have remained open, like I mentioned, since as early as last June. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, because this is sort of furthering the point that we were just talking about, related to the guidelines around testing, and testing itself had its own guidelines as specified by the EEOC. And an easy example of that was that employers can require viral testing. They can require things like temperature checks, but they can't require antibody testing, as an example, for a mandate for employees returning back to the workplace. And so, back to the compliance piece of all of this, and making sure that our clients remain compliant, we made sure that, everything that we were doing sort of checked all the right boxes related to HIPAA and EEOC and employment standards. And I mentioned we've been working on the TouchCare Shield program. Is we've been working with employers since as early as last June on this testing program and doing surveillance testing, and had a lot of success. One of those employers, right here in New York, in the heart of the pandemic at the time, has remained open since then, and we've been testing everybody on a weekly basis since June. And everybody has been in the office since that day, right? Over 200 people in the office every day since June, and we've been able to detect far more than three occurrences of COVID, but we've also been able to keep the COVID from spreading to anybody else in the office by having a right strategy in place to quickly reflex to additional testing when necessary and when we do get a positive test. So the program worked, and it continues to work with our clients. And now that the vaccine is ramping, we're continuing to evolve our TouchCare Shield program to include more information and tracking around vaccines. We're actually actively tracking vaccine uh, data for certain employers that we work with already who have brought employees back to the work with a vaccine requirement. We continue to do testing, like I mentioned, and the combination of both is sort of ultimately where this is all heading as the vaccinations quickly do ramp up. And so I guess the point is we've designed this Touch Care Shield program specifically for helping employers reopen their doors in the face of the pandemic, and that timeline looks different for everybody. But when you are ready and when you are looking for strategies to effectively track vaccinations or provide testing, et cetera, TouchCare is here with programs to help. And so with that, we are going to, I believe, turn this over to Q&A. And like I mentioned, we got a lot of questions coming through here during Dorit's presentation, so I will try to get to as many of them as possible. And if we don't get to them, maybe we can follow up afterwards with an email from TouchCare, kind of addressing some of the leftover questions. So the first one, and a couple here for Dorit, if an employer establishes a mandate and an employee has a serious reaction from the vaccine, is that employer then liable?
Probably yes. So if the vaccine is taken under a work mandate, any serious injuries are probably covered by workers' compensation. Just to put that in context, however, uh, at this point, very few harms were convincingly related to COVID-19 vaccines, and those are extremely rare. And the converse of that is that a COVID-19 outbreak in the workplace would probably also give rise to workplace liability if an employee contracts it on the place, and the risks of harm from COVID are substantially higher than that of the vaccine.
Right. And this is really sort of a bit of a follow-up question. There's a couple of them here that came through all at once. Can mandates only be applied to certain subsets of the employee population, for instance, depending on their role? Customer-facing employees versus back office employees, et cetera. Is it possible to structure it and discriminate in that way?
So it's not discrimination when you're treating different groups that are really different in different ways. Discrimination means that you're treating similar cases differently.
Right.
You can structure your vaccine policy according to the needs of employees. For example, it's very common in the healthcare setting, in influenza mandates, to require patient-facing employees to get influenza vaccine, but not necessarily employees with no patient contact. So yes, you can distinguish between different categories of employees and require vaccine only when there's a need.
Awesome. Next one is for TouchCare. Does TouchCare assist members with coordinating vaccine appointments? Quick, easy, short answer: yes, we do. We are doing that daily, as you can imagine. We've also created a resource center that is accessible through our website for members and for our clients, for insurance brokers, whoever is looking for information that aggregates state by state data and resources for finding vaccines and information about vaccines. Um, Sorry, I'm trying to read through some of these as we go here. Um, can I ask employees if they've been vaccinated or plan to get vaccinated in a non-anonymous survey?
So According to the EUC, the asking about vaccine status is not a problem in terms of the IDA or other discrimination law, because there's a whole set of reasons people may not be vaccinated that have nothing to do with exposing a disability. So the concern there is that asking people if they're vaccinated or want to be vaccinated may disclose a disability where you're not allowed to disclose that, may inquire about disability related information where it's impermissible. Just asking about vaccine status, no. If you start asking them, if you didn't get the vaccine, do you have a medical reason and what is it? Then you're running into a very tricky ground.
Right.
But just, are you vaccinating, or are you going to get the vaccinate, or did you get vaccinated, is probably okay.
A few more questions for you here, Dorit. Most of them are geared towards you. This one sort of has to do with and even acknowledges it, right? The strangeness around the impact on privacy rights about private health information for employees. But if an employee is trying to conceive, for instance, and is concerned about the impact of the vaccine, do they need to disclose to get an accommodation?
So the problem with this one is that it lies between drawing on a myth and drawing on something real. The myth is that COVID-19 vaccine harm fertility. That's a claim that's been shared on the internet, and there's no real basis for that. The real concern is, while we have increasingly reassuring data about COVID-19 vaccine in pregnancy, it's very early, and people may be concerned that getting the vaccine in early pregnancy may have side effects even very early that we don't know of yet. I would say that if the concern is fertility based, so the question was disclosure, but I'll also address, is that basis for an accommodation at all? If the concern is fertility based, it's probably not ground for accommodation. But if the concern is pregnancy based, there may be reasons to, at least in this early period, be more lenient with pregnant employees in terms of getting the vaccine. As to disclosure, when you're asking a question that touches on disability, there's more concern. Employees that want to claim an accommodation under the ADA do need to give you ground that there's that they have a disability, but on the other hand, you have to work the same way you would work with accommodation on other ADA disabilities to protect their privacies and not overstep into inquiring things that you're not allowed to ask under the ADA.
And I assume this next one is somewhat of a follow-up to that, in the sense that it touches on religion, right? So how does an employee prove their eligibility for a religious exemption? Say for instance, a member of the Church of Science.
Good. This is a really tricky area. And in the past, most of the litigation around vaccine mandates before COVID was around religious exemptions and exactly around the question of how do you show exemption. It's an area where you can easily run into pitfalls. A couple of things to keep in mind. First, the standard is not, does the employee belong to an organized religion that opposes vaccines, but does the employee have a personal, sincere religious objections to vaccines? So you can't ask them for a letter from the clergy to prove this, because they don't have to have a clergy. You can't say, if you belong to a religion that supports vaccines, so if you're a Jew or a Catholic, for example, you can't have a real objection, because it's not your job to enforce the religion beliefs. It's just your job to respect it if they have a personal belief. So you're asking, what can you do? You can require them to write out what the religious objection to vaccines is, to set out why they think that vaccines are in tension with their religion belief. You can't assess the rationality of that, but a lot of those letters are going to end up being something along the line of, I think vaccines are really dangerous, and there's a biblical verse that says, my body is my temple. If the letter shows that the main concern is safety concern and not religion, then it's not a religious exemption. The Third Circuit has talked about this relatively recent in a case called Fallon, and there it said, to be really a religious objection, it has to be about fundamental matters. So not about is this vaccine safe, but your general big questions such as do we have a soul and so forth. It has to be part of a general belief system. So you can't grab one biblical verse and use it to get out of vaccinating. You have to show it's part of your general belief system. And often, but not always, religions come with external symbols or rituals. So that could help look at this. But it's really tricky, and you need to be careful in evaluating sincerity. The best you can probably do is request employees that claim a religious belief to write it out and see if there's any real warning sign in what they write that tells you it's not really religion, but it's going to be hard to police this.
Well, I think that is all of the Q&A here. I think we covered most of them. And thank you all for the participation. And Mr. Rice, thank you as well for your participation and your expertise on this topic. Obviously, a really confusing time for employers and employees alike trying to navigate what the next phase of this pandemic looks like as we do try to return to some sort of normalcy. And like I said, you could sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's really swampy between here and there, right? As we sort of try to navigate our way through it. And totally appreciate your insights and expertise on the topic and your time as well. And thank you to the participants for all the great questions and for joining. And with that, I think we will wrap it up. So thanks, everyone.